Welcome back to our channel dedicated to exploring the depths of our sacred theological heritage. Today, I want to talk to you about something that should shake us to our very core as believers. Something that, once we understand it, will fundamentally change how we view our religious practices. I'm referring to the preservation of our Hadith, the sayings and the teachings of our Prophet and the 12 Imams, peace be upon them all. Now, you might be thinking that we've heard discussions about Hadith authenticity before. So, what's new here? Well, let me tell you what I'm about to share with you isn't just another academic discussion. This is about the very survival of our deen and religion itself. This is about the very foundation of how we understand and practice our religion. We're talking about the preservation and authenticity of our Hadith literature. Here's my thesis, and I want to say it very carefully. The Hadith of our 12 Imams have been meticulously preserved. Our early Shia canonical collections, the works of our great Hadith compilers like Shaykh Kulayni, Shaykh Saduq, Shaykh Tusi, these should be fully trusted. The Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them, took solid and concrete measures to guarantee the preservation of their teachings. But, and this is crucial, later Shia scholarship borrowed problematic methodologies from Sunni sources that have weakened our confidence in our own Hadith heritage, our rich Hadith heritage. Think about that for a moment. We had a perfect system, divinely guided, and we abandoned it for methods developed by those who don't even accept the authority of our Imams. In this podcast, I'm going to walk you through 9 powerful arguments that will demonstrate why we must return to trusting our Hadith collections completely. We'll explore the wisdom of some of our great scholars like Muhammad Amin al-Astarabadi, Yusuf al-Bahraini, Shaykh Amili, and others who understood what was at stake. Argument 1: the absolute necessity of preservation. Let's start with a fundamental question. Why is Hadith preservation so critical? You see, Islam is an incredibly complex system of beliefs and practices. In this podcast, we will focus on the practices, also known as fiqh, but the exact same arguments apply to the vast amount of hadith we have on beliefs, on aqaid, and also the vast amount of hadith we have on the tafsir of the Quran by the Imams. So let's take the example of fiqh, our Islamic jurisprudence. It is incredibly complex. We have more than 100,000 hadith that cover every aspect of human life, from how we pray to how we conduct business, from marriage to inheritance, from ritual purity to social interactions. Just browse through the contents of Wasail al-Shia. It's vast, comprehensive. The English translation is now available online, and you can access it very easily. The Prophet himself, peace be upon him and his family, told us seeking knowledge, ilm, is obligatory upon every Muslim. And this isn't just any knowledge. This is the knowledge of how to practice our religion correctly. And where do we find this knowledge? In the Hadith. Think about it. When we learned how to pray, did we open the Quran and figure it out from there alone? Of course not. The Quran tells us to establish prayer, but it doesn't tell us how many rakat for Fajr or the exact words of tashahhud or the specific movements and their sequences. All of this comes from Hadith. As the Great scholar Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi explained in his monumental work Biharul Anwar, the Hadith are the keys to understanding the Quran itself. Without them, we are lost in interpretation, drowning in confusion. Argument 2. Hadith versus Quran in daily practice. Now, this might sound controversial initially, but please hear me out. While we absolutely revere the Quran as the word of Allah, when it comes to the practical day-to-day practice of Islam, Hadith is what we cannot live without. Imagine a new convert to Islam. If they had access only to the Quran but no Hadith, could they practice Islam? Yes, they know that they need to worship Allah, they need to be just, kind, beautiful principles from the Quran. But could they perform wudu? Could they pray? Could they fast correctly during the month of Ramadan? Could they perform hajj? The answer is no. But give that same convert a collection of authentic hadith without deep knowledge of the Quran, and they could practice Islam from day one. They'd know exactly how to purify themselves, how to pray, what to say, when to bow, when to prostrate. Shaykh Ramili, in his masterwork Wasail al-Shia, organized thousands of hadith precisely because he understood this reality. He knew that Muslims need practical guidance, and that guidance comes through the preserved teachings of the Prophet and the Imams. And while the Holy Quran is our meticulous divine constitution, it's the hadith, the teachings and tradition of the Prophet and his purified household that provide us with the detailed roadmap for Islamic life. This isn't diminishing the Quran's importance, not at all. Rather, it's recognizing that Allah, in His infinite wisdom, established a system where the Quran provides the foundation and the Hadith of the Ahlul Bayt provides the detailed blueprint. The great scholar Muhammad Amin al-Astarabadi pointed out in his monumental work, Al-Fawaid al-Madaniyah, you could theoretically live your entire life without knowing the entire Quran and still be a practicing Muslim through following authentic hadith. But try to practice Islam for even a single day without hadith guidance. Impossible. Argument 3. Divine responsibility for preservation. Here's where things get really serious, and we need to think deeply about this. If Allah, in His infinite wisdom and mercy, wanted to preserve His deen, His religion, then He must have preserved the hadith. There's no way around this logic. Muhammad Amin al-Astarabadi argued precisely this point. He said that divine wisdom necessitates the preservation of everything essential for religious practice. And since hadith is essential, it must have been preserved. And those who claim widespread hadith corruption, and I'm sorry to say this includes some of our contemporary scholars, are essentially saying that Allah failed to preserve His religion. Now, here's where we need to think deeply. If hadith are this essential, if they contain what the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his family called obligatory knowledge, and when he said seeking knowledge is obligatory upon every Muslim, then wouldn't Allah ensure their preservation? The great scholar Yusuf al-Bahraini, in his masterpiece Al-Hadith, brilliantly argues this point. He says, and I'm paraphrasing here, that to claim widespread corruption in our hadith literature is to essentially claim that Allah failed in His promise to preserve His religion. It is that serious because without authentic hadith, we simply cannot practice Islam as it was intended. Argument 4. Religion is lost without hadith preservation. Let me be absolutely clear about this. Any system, religious or not, whose foundational teachings are compromised is a lost cause. If our hadith base has been corrupted, then our religion is lost. There is no Islam without reliable hadith. The deen would be finished. Imagine a professor teaching in a university who couldn't protect his lecture notes from getting corrupted by a few bad students. And in the final exam, nobody knows now the right answer from wrong. Would you study in such a school? This isn't hyperbole, this is cold, hard logic. Every single act of worship we perform, every prayer, every fast, every pilgrimage, every act of purification relies on details provided by hadith. And if these hadith are unreliable, then our worship is invalid. And if our worship is invalid, what remains of our religion? Consider this. If we are not certain that the way we are praying is correct because we doubt the hadith that teach prayer, will that prayer be accepted? Worship requires certainty, conviction, and confidence that we're doing what Allah commanded. The great scholar who gave his life defending Shia beliefs understood this perfectly. He argued that our hadith collections, particularly those compiled during the times of the Imams and shortly after, represent the authentic voice of the Ahlul Bayt. To doubt them is to doubt the Imams themselves. Argument 5. The importance of absolute certainty. This brings us to a crucial psychological and spiritual point. No acts of worship can be performed properly without conviction and certainty. Doubt and suspicion don't just weaken religion, they destroy it entirely. We must have 100% certainty and full conviction in our hadith. When we stand for prayer, we need to know with absolute certainty that we are praying correctly. When we fast, we need to be certain about when to begin and when to break our fast. This certainty isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. The Quran itself tells us in Surah Yunus, verse 36, most of them follow nothing but conjecture. Surely conjecture is of no avail against the truth. If we're following conjecture in religious practice because we doubt our hadith, we're building our entire religious life on weak foundations, on sand. Mirza Muhammad al-Akhbari emphasized this point repeatedly in his writings. He argued that the early Shia had complete confidence in their hadith collections because they understood the meticulous process by which these hadith have been preserved and transmitted. It was only later when foreign methodologies crept in that doubt began to poison our certainty. Think about the psychological burden of constant doubt. Imagine praying 5 times a day while thinking, I hope this is right, but I can't be sure because the hadith might be weak. That's not worship. That's anxiety. That's not submission to Allah. That's confusion and distress. Argument 6. The Imam's direct command to trust. Now, how can we be sure that these compilations are trustworthy? Well, let me share with you something profound, a direct communication from our 12th Imam. May Allah hasten his reappearance. That should settle this matter once and for all. In a Tawqi, which is a signed letter to Al-Qasim, and I'm quoting directly from Masail al-Shia, Volume 1, Hadith 61. None of our followers have any excuse to doubt what our trustworthy representatives convey from us, as they are known to be those whom we entrust with our secrets and whom we task with delivering them. The Imam himself is telling us that we have no excuse to doubt what the trustworthy narrators convey. No excuse. This isn't a suggestion or a recommendation. This is a direct command from our living Imam. Who are these trustworthy representatives? They include the great companions of the Imams who compiled the earliest Hadith collections, the authors of the 400 Usul books. Shaykh Ramili, the compiler of Wasail al-Shia, explains that this establishes a principle. The books of our early, trustworthy scholars should be accepted with confidence. They were the trustworthy representatives that the Imam spoke about. Do we all agree that Shaykh Kulayni was a thiqa, that Shaykh Saduq was a thiqa? What does the Arabic word thiqa mean? It refers to someone who is trustworthy, someone you can rely upon to convey the truth accurately. This raises an important question. If our thiqa compilers included weak or unreliable traditions in their collections, how can they truly be considered thiqa? This term itself becomes self-contradictory. When we simultaneously label these scholars as trustworthy, while at the same time casting doubt on the reliability of their work, which means they're not thiqa. And this doesn't make sense. Either we stop calling them thiqa or we need to start trusting them and their compilations. Argument 7, the meticulous chain of transmission. Let's discuss how the hadith from the Ahlul Bayt actually reached us. This wasn't some haphazard process that happened over centuries in an uncontrolled way. No, this was a methodical, systematic preservation effort that began during the lifetime of the Imams themselves. The companions of the Imams compiled what we call the Usul, the foundation books. And these were 400 plus separate books, each compiled by trustworthy companions who heard directly from the Imams. These were carefully preserved records, often reviewed by the Imams themselves. Then, scholars like Shaykh Kulayni didn't just randomly collect from these usul. He spent 2 decades traveling, comparing manuscripts, verifying authenticity. He had access to companions who had studied directly under multiple Imams. His work wasn't done in isolation. It was a community effort, verified and re-verified by multiple scholars of his time. The same goes for Shaykh Saduq and the other early compilers. They weren't working centuries after the fact with dubious sources. They were working with direct, carefully preserved materials, often within living memory of the Imams themselves. Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi, when he compiled Biharul Anwar, he wasn't starting from scratch. He was working with these already authenticated collections, adding layers of verification and organization. The scholar Saleh Samahiji, in his brilliant defense of the Hadith, pointed out that when the Imam tells us we have no excuse to doubt these transmissions, he's essentially granting them a divine seal of approval. To doubt them after this is to disobey the Imam himself. Argument 8. Understanding conflicting Hadith. Now the question is, what about the contradictory Hadith? How can we trust everything when some Hadith seem to conflict with others? This is a fair question and our scholars have addressed it thoroughly. Yes, there are Hadith that appear to conflict, but, and this is crucial, these conflicts can be resolved by any Shia, any believer, using rules that are mentioned in the Hadith themselves. We know the historical context of our Imams' lives. They lived under hostile governments, faced constant surveillance, and had to protect their followers from persecution. Taqiyya wasn't just a theoretical concept, it was a survival necessity, as the Shia community faced extreme oppression from the rulers. Dedicated entire sections of his works to explaining how these apparent contradictions actually demonstrate the authenticity of our Hadith corpus. If someone were fabricating Hadith, would they include contradictions? No, they'd make everything consistent. The presence of these apparent conflicts along with the methods to resolve them, shows the organic, authentic nature of our hadith preservation. The Imams themselves give us the tools to navigate these apparent contradictions. They told us that when we find conflicting narrations, and these are rare cases in our hadith, okay, very rare, but when we do find conflicting narrations, we should look at which one agrees with the Quran, which one goes against what our enemies say, which one was more widely known among the companions. And they advise us to take a more cautious position in matters of worship. These aren't arbitrary rules, they are divinely inspired methods for navigating the complexity of real world religious guidance. The scholar Saleh al-Karzakani wrote extensively about how taqiyya explains many of these apparent contradictions. Sometimes the Imam had to give a ruling that matched the Sunni position to protect his followers from persecution. And this doesn't make the hadith false, it just makes it contextual, nuanced, and real. Mirza Muhammad al-Akhbari, in his analytical works, demonstrates that when you apply these principles systematically, the vast majority of apparent contradictions start to resolve themselves. And what seems like confusion is actually a sophisticated system that protected the Shia community while preserving authentic teachings for those who knew how to properly understand them. Argument 9, the later deviation, a borrowed methodology. Here's where our discussion takes a critical turn. What happened to this confidence in our hadith heritage? Unfortunately, starting around the 11th century, some of our scholars began importing methodologies from Sunni hadith criticism. They started applying concepts like strict Rijal analysis, scrutinizing every single narrator in a chain in ways that our early scholars never did. Think about this. Shaykh Kulayni, who had access to the original usul, who lived close to the time of the Imams, who spent 2 decades verifying his work, he considered the Hadith in Al-Kafi to be authentic. But scholars who came centuries later without access to those original sources started declaring many of these same Hadith as weak based on theoretical narrator analysis. Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi, in his introduction to Bihar al-Anwar, he notes that the early scholars had access to evidence and context that we have lost. He argues that their judgment should be given significant weight. The great reformer Muhammad Amin al-Astarawadi puts it brilliantly in Al-Fawaid al-Madaniyah. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, "How strange that we doubt the books compiled by those who met the Imams or their direct students, who had access to the original sources, and who dedicated their lives to this preservation. Yet we have confidence in the opinions of those who came centuries later." The practical implications. If we follow the Usuli methodology of Hadith criticism, we end up rejecting a large amount of Hadith that our community acted upon for centuries. Suddenly their practices become questionable because some narrator in a chain is deemed unknown by someone writing centuries after the fact. But here's what's even more problematic. This approach creates a class of religious elites who become the gatekeepers of religious knowledge. The average believer can no longer read a hadith from Al-Kafi or Man la Yahduruhu al-Faqih and act upon it with confidence. They must first consult whether each specific hadith has been deemed authentic by contemporary standards. This isn't what our Imams intended. Remember, they said seeking knowledge is obligatory on every Muslim, and not just on a select group of hadith critics. reclaiming our heritage. So, what's the solution? We need to return to the methodology of our early scholars like Shaykh Amili. This means, and I'm going to list it in 4 points. Number one, trusting the judgment of early compilers who had access to original sources. Number two, understanding that apparent contradictions often have contextual explanations. Number three, recognizing the systematic nature of hadith preservation in our tradition. And number four, having confidence in acting upon hadith from our 4 canonical books and early compilations. Scholars like Mirza Hussain Nuri Tabarsi in his Mustadrak al-Wasail and Qazi Nurullah Shustari in his various works have shown that when you examine the evidence objectively, this is the most logical and faithful approach to our hadith heritage. The position we are advocating isn't about accepting everything blindly, but it's about trusting the verification work already done by scholars, by the thiqa scholars, the trustworthy scholars, who are in a much better position to verify than we are. Shaykh Kulayni didn't just compile random narrations, he spent 20 years verifying them against multiple sources. We do acknowledge that some hadith do require interpretation and contextualization, but this is different from wholesale rejection based on narrator criticism. As Yusuf al-Bahraini explains, what seems unreasonable to us initially might make perfect sense with proper context or understanding. A living tradition, when we trust our hadith heritage, we connect directly with our imams. Every hadith becomes a living link to the Ahlul Bayt. Abdullah ibn Salih al-Samahiji in his works describes this beautifully. He says that reading and acting upon these hadith isn't just following rules, it's participating in a sacred conversation that spans centuries. When we perform ablution according to a hadith from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, we're not just purifying ourselves, we're connecting with the Imam's teachings in a direct, unmediated way. So the next time we read a hadith from Al-Kafi or Man la Yahduruhu al-Faqih or any of our canonical collections, remember we're holding in our hands the preserved teachings of the Imams, transmitted through a chain of trustworthy believers, protected by divine providence, and meant for our guidance. The scholar Saleh al-Karzakani beautifully puts it in his works. When we trust our hadith heritage, we're not just preserving text, we're preserving the living tradition of the Ahlul Bayt. This is the confidence our ancestors had. And this is why they could face persecution, exile, hardship, while maintaining their faith. They had conviction. They knew their practices were authentic and traced directly back to these sources of divine guidance. As we wrap up today's discussion, we need to consider that the hadith of the Ahlul Bayt are not just historical documents. They are a sacred trust preserved through divine providence and human dedication. When Allah promised to preserve His religion, He meant the whole religion, the entire system of guidance necessary for human salvation. The meticulous preservation of hadith by the Imams and their companions wasn't accidental, it was part of the divine plan. But the tragedy is that many in our community have abandoned this certainty. Under the influence of methodologies borrowed from those who don't even accept our Imams, we've begun to doubt our own heritage. We've traded this certainty given to us by the Ahlul Bayt for the confusion of conflicting scholarly opinions. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can return to the confidence of our early scholars. We can embrace the certainty that comes from trusting the divinely guided preservation of our hadith. We can practice our religion with conviction, instead of constant doubt. It's not that we should accept everything blindly. We need to study the works of the great scholars I've mentioned. We need to read Muhammad Amin Astarabadi's Al-Fawaid al-Madaniya, explore Yusuf al-Bahraini's Hadaik al-Nadira, and dive into the introductions of our four canonical books and see how their compilers understood their mission. The truth is there, preserved, waiting for us to rediscover it. Our hadith are trustworthy. Our early collections are authentic. Our religion has been preserved. We just need the courage to accept this gift from Allah and His chosen representatives. This isn't about academic debate. This is about the survival of authentic Shia Islam. It's about whether we practice our religion with certainty or doubt, with confidence or confusion, with the guidance of the Ahlul Bayt, or the methodologies of those who rejected them. So thank you for joining me today. Until next time, may Allah guide us all to the straight path, and may Allah grant us certainty in our faith.